All right, thanks ever so much. I hope everyone can hear me. So it's a great pleasure to be invited to give this talk today. So I'm going to toggle a little bit between full screen and otherwise in the talk, because when it's full screen, I can't mouse to indicate things on the screen. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work we've been doing in Oxford, thinking about essentially ways to improve approximate Bayesian computation, particularly in terms of using ABC in the context of sort of stochastic or agent-based models, so really complicated and fairly time-consuming to simulate. So before I start, I just want to say that all of the multi-fidelity ABC work was carried out by Tom Prescott in Oxford. So Tom's also on the call, and at points I might defer to him for some of the bits and pieces. And Tom as well, if there's anything you want to add in, any questions, just jump in. I also just wanted to point out there's references that come with this talk listed, and you can find them both. You can find them both in the archive. Okay. But to start, because I guess maybe not a lot of this community is familiar with some of the work we do in my group, I thought I'd just give a bit of an introduction to who we are and what we do. So we have a very applied research focus, thinking about understanding the mechanisms that drive collective cell motility and how they interface with proliferation and death to contribute to very complicated biological processes, most of the time focusing on processes associated with embryo development, but also within the context of diseases such as tumor growth within cancer and repair, so wound healing. And we often have sort of multiplex quantitative where we want to interrogate those data using validated and biologically realistic models. So that's our focus. And we always try to work in an interdisciplinary sort of framework where we're collaborating with experimental groups who are doing experiments both in wild type and perturbed scenarios. And our role is essentially to build mathematical models of those experiments and simulations of them, and then to connect with the data via different methods for data analysis and model testing. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of projects that we've worked on over the last few years that will kind of set the scene for why we might want to make ABC a bit more efficient and sort of some of the issues that we have. So one of the projects is a sort of collective cell invasion related project, and it's invasion of the neural crest. So the neural crest is an embryonic cell population that migrates in streams out from the midline of the embryo, so down here, out from the midline of the embryo in very distinct streams. And they have to reach some distal targets, so in this context, moving kind of quite long distances, and doing that in the face of significant domain growth. So failure of the neural crest to migrate results in sort of significant morphological abnormalities of the face, the neck, and the cardiovascular system. So we really need sort of better techniques for tissue repair and regeneration, and therapeutic avenues of prevention to essentially mitigate the effects of these diseases. And I'd argue that to do that, we need a really good understanding of the normal events that control craniofacial morphogenesis. The other thing about the neural crest is it's fairly easy or easily accessible to manipulation and in vivo observation. So it's a really ideal system in which to study sort of long distance cell migration more generally. Why do we need mathematics? Because there are huge numbers of different cell types as biochemical signals, and they're all interacting with extensive feedback, feed-forward, and nonlinearities across multiple spatial and temporal scales. So really mechanistic models provide one of the only ways in which to sort of tease apart the contributions of these various components to the process. The other thing to say is that most of the experiments we do are carried out in vitro or in vivo animal models, and so it's very difficult then to translate those understanding gained in those settings into humans and into the clinic. And mathematical models, if they're properly calibrated, can provide a bridge between in vitro and in vivo scenarios. So here's some work that was done in my group, actually by Linus Schumacher, I think is on this call. And so the focus of this particular part of the project was to understand the role of population heterogeneity within neural crest cell invasion. So we had an agent-based model where essentially the to go out of this again, where the sort of the little discs you can see in these simulations are the cells. They're entering the domain at the left-hand side, and they're essentially trying to invade along this sort of neural crest migratory route in the face of domain growth. The thing that's helping the cells is that there's a chemoattractant, so a chemical that cells are attracted to, and cells essentially want to move up gradients in that chemoattractant. And at the same time, they consume the chemoattractant, so that's where you can see over here patches where the levels are very low. So essentially, we developed this hybrid discrete continuum model, and we used it to show that heterogeneity, here defined in terms of the ability of cells to sense and respond to this chemical gradient, was essential for successful invasion. So here, the leader cells in orange are ones that can sense and respond to the gradient, essentially get some positional information and some guidance cues, and the purple ones can't, they just follow. Another model prediction was that essentially the invasion is more efficient, more successful with fewer leaders, and that you want them to be situated right at the front of this invading stream, and that was something that was subsequently verified experimentally. So this was a project that is, I guess, what I would sort of describe as quite classically developmental biology, in the sense that at that point the model's quite complicated, but there's not really a way to calibrate it to data, because there simply isn't essentially quantitative information coming out of the experiments at that time. But nonetheless, you can see that the model is quite complicated. It's got quite a lot of parameters, and if we did have the data, it would be quite sort of time-consuming and difficult task to calibrate it. Moving on, a second project that we looked at, and this was in collaboration with Matt Simpson's group at Queensland University of Technology, was to look at the role of cell-cell pushing in cell invasion. So in this context, we were working in silico, looking at scratch assay dynamics. So you can see here that within a scratch assay, what you do is you grow cells to confluence within a dish, and then you sort of mechanically scrape away a portion of the cells, leaving an empty region, and then the cells proliferate and migrate into this space in order to essentially repair the wound. So we wanted to understand the role of cell-cell interactions, and in particular cell pushing within cell invasion. So one of the things that we did within this experiment, first of all, was to apply a drug called mitomycin C, which essentially stops the cells from proliferating. So you can simplify the problem, and just looked at sort of how they move to invade the available space. But one thing that's certainly true is that although the cells don't actually proliferate, they still increase in size over the cell cycle. So that's something we might need to take into account. So here's just some data. So on the top left, you can see that cell diameter in these experiments definitely increases on average over time. So we developed an off-lattice model, which was a suite of essentially interacting agents, and we use this to describe the experiments. So the idea is that you model the position of cell as xi, it changes in time, and it changes because the cells can undergo random movements, and they can also interact with other cells. And so those interactions would be essentially cells repelling each other if they get too close, and maybe attracting at quite short distances to replicate cell-cell adhesion. So what you can do then is you can develop a range of different models of different levels of complexity of this system. So the simplest model might just say, well, I'm going to ignore pairwise interactions, so set all the Fij's to be 0, and look at the ability of that model to replicate the experimental data. And then you can include gradually, as you increase the kind of model complexity, you can include these sort of pairwise interactions, which are repelling at short distances and attracting at medium distances. And you can also then sort of go a bit more complex, sort of still, where you include the sort of dynamics of the cell size over time. So what we showed in this work was that if you essentially take that suite of models and you do quantitative comparison to the data that you get from the experiments, so on the left-hand side, that if you neglect the finite size of cells together with intercellular forces, you're going to significantly reduce the ability of the model to mimic and predict cell invasion speeds and profiles. So this was kind of a step for us in our group in the quantitative direction in terms of quantitative comparison of models with data and trying to pin down the model and the parameters of the model to the data. So this is really how we got into starting to think about ABC and how we would use ABC to parameterize models. So we began to think about working within a Bayesian framework, estimating the parameters of a model theta given data d in terms of the posterior parameter distribution. And so using Bayes' rules to write that as the product or as proportional to the product of the likelihood and the prior distribution. So both the models that I described to you have an intractable likelihood. So we were straight away thinking about likelihood-free methods, and in particular thinking about approximate Bayesian computation. So I'm pretty sure that everyone on the line is probably familiar with this, but I just wanted the kind of concreteness and for the sake of some notation to just introduce ABC. So the idea here is essentially estimating the posterior distribution of the model parameters using repeated forward simulation. So for a number of times until I reach some stopping criterion that we often call S, I'm going to pick a parameter from my prior distribution, simulate the model with that parameter to get some output Y, and then if that output Y is close enough to the data in some sense, then I'll accept that parameter into my posterior distribution, and under ABC rejection sampling, I'll just essentially give it a weight 1. So in this example I've shown here on this slide, you can see that when I sample theta and simulate to get Y in the data space, then actually what I'm trying to indicate here is that the data, the simulation output is too far away from the data, so I'd set this weight to be 0. But if I choose a different parameter value, I would simulate and get an output that was much closer to the data, and I would get assign a weight of 1 to the parameter value. So in terms of notation, and I'll say this, try and remember to say this again in the talk, then we're always going to talk about sort of parameter space. So this is parameters coming from the prior distribution mapping to a data space, and then within that data space, essentially I've got what I might call an epsilon close region. Okay, so this is just the little region that's indicated by the dashed lines and denoted by omega. So the idea here is that I need some distance. I've got a sense of my data space, and that might include a sort of summary, be in terms of summary statistics of the data, but and I've got a distance metric, and basically the epsilon close region is just anything that's within a distance epsilon of the data according to those summary statistics and that distance function. Okay. So as a very sort of simple example, we looked at the repressilator model. So this is a system of 3 mRNAs and proteins. So our mRNAs translate the proteins, and then the protein essentially goes back and represses the production of another mRNA. And you can see on the left-hand side the kind of functional form of this repression here. So because you've kind of essentially got a series of negative feedback loops, what you see is that the system oscillates. So you see oscillations in mRNA and protein 1, closely followed by oscillations in mRNA, protein 2 and 3, and so on. So as our sort of simple example, what we wanted to do was to estimate the parameter n, which is in the Hill coefficient of the repression function. I mean, we're going to do that by taking some data like you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. So under the kind of ABC rejection sampling approach, we're going to sample from the prior on n. So essentially this was just a uniform prior between 1 and 4. We're going to simulate the model and then measure the distance between the simulated data and the actual sort of data. And then whenever the distance is less than the threshold, so the dashed line here indicates a threshold of 50, we're accepting the parameters into the posterior distribution. Okay, so that's all well and good, and if you do lots and lots of simulations, you can estimate a posterior distribution, and from that you can get, for example, characterize that distribution using the mean. So it's possible to do that because this is quite a simple model, right? But nonetheless, to get 500 posterior mean estimates, well, each one of those takes minutes to get, so it's quite a sort of time-consuming process. The bottleneck is really repeated simulation of the model, and you can see that there's a trade-off, obviously, between kind of simulation time and the variance of any estimates that you get out. And I should highlight that, you know, I think this is really sort of where the problems lie, because for all of the sort of practical problems that we're interested in, we're not just going to estimate one parameter And to generate one of those posterior distributions probably takes much longer than 40 minutes because the simulations themselves are fairly complicated. So we began to think in this project about ways in which we could increase the efficiency of ABC. So there's lots of well-known ways already to conduct essentially a more intelligent exploration of parameter space. So instead of just sampling from the prior, you can use importance sampling or use sequential Monte Carlo, etc. So we knew about all those, but then we started to think about different approaches, which were ones essentially that would aim to make the weight, so this accept-reject decision, less expensive to calculate. So one obvious way in which you can do that is to make simulations less expensive. So you can optimize your code, and I guess you want to sort of do that anyway. But I guess another way in which you could do this would be to transform the model in some way. So you might want to reduce the dimension of the model or use a surrogate or approximate model. You might think that you could get away with simulating over a shorter time interval, or even just use a coarser discretization of space and time. So what I want to focus on today is showing that you can make the weights, this accept-reject decision, sort of a less expensive thing to calculate by effectively using these approaches to model simplification. But at the same time, because this is kind of an approach that's orthogonal to doing a more intelligent exploration of space, you can essentially do both at once. And you can do that whilst maintaining the accuracy of the ABC posterior distribution you're trying to calculate. Okay, so this brings us on to really the focus of the talk finally, which is to think about multi-fidelity ABC. So again, just a diagram which hopefully highlights the notation that we're going to use in the talk. So again, we've got parameter spaces as defined over our prior distribution in the center in orange. And now we've got, I'm going to sort of assume for now that we've got two different models. So we've got what I would describe as the high fidelity model, which is essentially the model that we actually want to parameterize or estimate the posterior distributions for. But we've also got what I'll describe as the low fidelity model, which is in some ways a model that is a simpler representation of the high fidelity model. So, and then I pick a sample of parameter from the prior distribution. I map into high fidelity data space to give data y with parameter yi with parameter theta I. And then I have a notion of being epsilon close in that high fidelity data space. And then in the same way, if I sample theta from my prior distribution and map, simulate using my low fidelity model, this will give me output yi tilde. And I have a notion of being close in low fidelity space, and this will be kind of epsilon tilde close. So in general, I have to, in each of the high fidelity and low fidelity contexts, I need a distance function. I need essentially the data that all the summary statistics that come out there and an acceptance threshold epsilon. All right. So I guess the questions that you begin to ask then is, so how can you combine the outputs of the two models so that the result are unbiased weights, and how can you make this process efficient? So the first question might be, like, why do you have to combine the outputs of the two models? Why can you not just use your low fidelity model? Right? So the idea of a low fidelity model is it's much more efficient to simulate, and it's going to allow you essentially to use ABC much quicker. The problem is, though, that there's going to be times when the accept reject decision that you would make using the low fidelity model is not going to be the same as what you would make using the high fidelity model. So this is just indicated in this figure on the bottom left. So much of the time, and it's indicated with these blue dots, you'll sample the prior distribution, and you'll the distance functions will be such that you'll essentially accept or reject the parameters under both of the models, or essentially weight them the same under both of the models. Okay, and you'd hope that that would be the case if your low fidelity model is a pretty good good approximation of your high fidelity model. But nonetheless, there's always going to be times when essentially you get some false positives, as I'm going to call them. So if I simulate under my low fidelity model, I would essentially set that parameter into the ABC posterior, whereas if I'd simulated under the high fidelity model, actually wouldn't. And I'll also get false negatives where my low fidelity models would give a result that I wouldn't accept the parameter value, but actually under the high fidelity model I would. So the reason essentially I can't just use the low fidelity model without thinking about it is it doesn't always tell me exactly the correct thing. So I want to think about how I can combine the outputs of both of the models to get unbiased weights, and I want to think about how to make this process efficient. So the basic idea is that I want to use the low fidelity as much as possible to make an early decision about whether to accept or reject a parameter value into the posterior distribution. And sometimes I'm going to check that decision using the high fidelity model. Importantly, the decision whether to check or not is going to be made essentially uniformly at random with some probability alpha, where the parameter alpha depends on the output of the low fidelity simulation and possibly on the parameter value as well. For the purposes of this talk, and actually so far, we've kind of taken a really simple approach, which just says that whether I check or not using the high fidelity model essentially depends on whether how good or how close the low fidelity model is to the data. So in this context, what I'm saying here is that I check with probability e to 1 whether I've made the right accept or reject decision if my low fidelity model is essentially close to the data. And if my low fidelity model isn't close to the data, I check the output with some probability e to 2. And for simplicity going forward, I'm basically going to assume that the output data spaces, the observed data, the distance functions, and the acceptance thresholds are all exactly the same. So essentially, omega and epsilon tilde are identical between the low and the high fidelity models. It just makes life a bit easier, but everything is extendable to other cases. Okay. So I think on the next slide, I've just essentially stated the algorithm for completeness, and you'll be able to download the slides after the talk and have a look at them. But the idea really within the algorithm is I'm going to pick a parameter theta from the prior distribution. I'm going to simulate using the low fidelity approximate model to get some output yn tilde, and then we're going to assign a weight to that parameter depending on how close that simulation output is to the data. Then I generate my uniform random number between 0 and 1, and I also calculate the value of alpha, so it's e to 1 or e to 2 depending on the output of the simulation. And then if my uniform random is less than alpha, I'm actually going to go on and I'm going to simulate from the high fidelity model. So I'm going to generate yn from the high fidelity model, and I'm going to update the weight of my assigned to that parameter value depending on the output of that high fidelity model. So if the high fidelity model is close to the data or not. So it's all there. Okay, so let's see this in action on the repesylator model. Okay, so what do I get? So if I just use the high fidelity model essentially on its own, you can see that here's the distribution of posterior means I get out, and this is plotted as a function of the simulation time in seconds for each one of those. You can see that if instead of using the high fidelity model, the one I used a lower, essentially an approximate model to do the job, I would generate my posterior mean distribution in much quicker time, but you can definitely see that there's a bias, there's a real skew to the left in terms of the parameter estimates that I get out. But on the other hand, if you use multi-fidelity approaches, you really establish the essentially the correct you establish kind of there's no bias in the parameter estimates, and you attain those in much quicker time. I should say just for now that basically in this plot we've just set e to 1 and e to 2. So back here, this is our checking probability. In no matter the kind of output of the low fidelity model, we check with probability 0.1 that whether we made the decision correctly or not. Okay, so the real question then becomes, okay, how do I optimize this algorithm? Because essentially what I've got is I've got a choice of I've got a choice of continuation parameter. So just going back again, the continuation parameter is this decision to check my weights using the high fidelity model, and I've got values e⁻₁ and e⁻². And what I want to do is figure out how best to choose e⁻₁ and e⁻² to get the posterior distribution most efficiently. So I guess what we started thinking about was measures of efficiency. So you can think about the effective sample size within your set of accepted parameter values, and you can think then about observed efficiency, which is essentially the effective number of samples that you're generating per time unit, and that's closely related to the theoretical efficiency, and it's that you can work with in order to optimize the values of e⁻₁ and e⁻². So what's the idea? You can write the theoretical efficiency essentially in terms of the normalization parameter of your posterior distribution and a function phi that depends essentially on those two parameters, those continuation probabilities e⁻₁ and e⁻². And just down at the bottom of the slide, there's the expression for e⁻₁ and e⁻². And I guess what you see in there is that as well as e⁻₁ and e⁻², you've got a number of constants. And what do those constants relate to? Well, WFP is the probability of getting a false positive. That's basically the probability of, under the low fidelity model, accepting a parameter value, whereas under the high fidelity model, you wouldn't. And the probability of a false negative is the probability in which your low fidelity model says to reject a parameter value, whereas your high fidelity model would accept it. So that's two of the coefficients in that expression. And the other ones essentially just relate to the time it takes to generate the simulation. So T low down here is just the time it takes to generate a simulation under the low fidelity model, or the average time. And these two are the time it takes to generate a simulation under the high fidelity model, given the models are far or close to the data. Okay, so what's nice about this? Well, I can optimize, essentially, I can analytically, given values for the constants W, WFP, W, Fn, etc., given values for those, I can analytically write down expressions for the values that e⁻₁ and e⁻² should take to optimize the efficiency of the algorithm. Obviously, I don't have access to those estimating those. I don't have access to calculating those constants analytically, but what I can do is generate them, essentially numerical estimates of them, and I can do that on the fly as I'm generating samples from the prior distribution and simulating the model. So there is a way to figure out, in effect, what the optimal values of e⁻₁ and e⁻² should be. Okay, let's look at some results. So this is essentially just a plot that shows you where I'm picking parameters from in e⁻₁ and e⁻² space and what the distribution of efficiencies are given those parameter values. So over here in the sort of top right hand corner, if e⁻₁ and e⁻² are both 1, I've effectively just got ABC rejection sampling, and you can see that's that gives you the least efficient, essentially, algorithm in terms of the effective number of samples I get from the posterior per second. If you move down, you can drop down to early rejection, which is basically basically just saying I can reject parameters early after just using simulating only the low fidelity model, but I can't accept them early. And you can see that this provides a nice increase in efficiency relative to ABC rejection sampling. But if you take this point down here, which is the optimal e⁻₁ and e⁻² for this particular problem, you can see if you simulate there and use early accept, early rejection, then effectively that gives you the most efficient algorithm in terms of effective number of samples per second. Okay, so this is sort of like the halfway point really, and I just want to recap by saying that multi-fidelity ABC can give you time savings through the combined use of high and low fidelity models, and that you can learn all continuation probabilities as the algorithm proceeds, and you can separately control the rates of checking of early acceptance and early rejection. What else I'll say? Oh, and also maybe I'll just say one more thing before I go too much further, and that's that the rates of false positives and negatives can be reduced by generating the high fidelity model output conditional on the low fidelity model output. So I didn't really say too much about this before, but when I stated the algorithm in here, sort of if you look at line 8, what I said was that actually if I need to check using the high fidelity model, I'm going to generate output of the high fidelity model conditional on not just the parameter value, but also on the output of the low fidelity model. And that in itself is really important in this context, because if you can do that, you'll reduce essentially the rates of false positives and false negatives, and that will give you smaller continuation probabilities and essentially a smaller simulation cost. So just before I take questions, I wanted to say something about how to do that. So it's generating data from the high fidelity model conditional on the output of the low fidelity model. So as a very, very simple example of that, how to do that, you might be simulating your high fidelity model from time 0 to time t, and simulating your low fidelity model could be as simple as simulating from 0 to t over 2 or even t over 10, something. But there's many other things you could do. If you have a simulator that depends on a time step or a space step, you might just increase the time step or the space step to get a low fidelity model that's essentially more efficient. Or you can do something like use the same random input into your models. So in our context, that's precisely what we did. So we used a common noise input stream within the low fidelity model and the high fidelity model, and that just ensures that these models essentially return, if you like, the same data as far as possible. So as an example, using geometric Brownian motion, I want to essentially, for this SDE, use the same Brownian path to generate both the high and the low fidelity simulations. Oh, and I need to play this properly. So the idea here is that if you essentially use the same noise input stream for your Brownian motion when you're solving a PDE, so this would be the same Brownian sort of input stream, just with different sort of time resolution, compared to sort of completely independent Brownian input streams. When you look at the essentially the simulation that comes out from using those same input streams, they're very, very close together. Whereas if you don't couple the two simulations, then they tend not to be. So this idea of sort of generating the output of the high fidelity model conditional on the output of the low fidelity model is super important. Okay. At that point, I'm quite happy to take any questions if anyone has any. I'll stop sharing screen for a minute. Oh, actually, I think I can see. Are there any questions that anyone would want to ask?
Yes, Gail has a question. So Gail, please go ahead.
Now you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. This is really interesting, really nice. Is there any advantage in having more than one low fidelity model that's kind of capturing the different aspects of your high fidelity model? I know that's kind of an obvious question, I suppose.
No, it's a really good question, and totally right. So I think you can think up numerous situations where different reduced models, for example, might work in different regions of parameter space. Mm. You might want multiple low fidelity models, or even you could think of having kind of a hierarchy of low fidelity models and sort of doing this as a successive thing. So I think there's lots of ways in which you could bring in multiple low fidelity models and really make a difference. And that is definitely something that we'd like to do.
Okay, good. Yeah.
All right. If there aren't any other questions, I'll keep going.
I have a quick question, Ruth. In the algorithm, I think you reweighted the weight when you check or after running the high fidelity model.
Yeah.
I think you divided it by 1 minus alpha, or there was some kind of adjustment.
Yes.
Can you perhaps briefly say something about the intuition, why we need that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to try and share screen again so I can put it back on here we go. Where is it? Yeah, in here, because I guess you have to, how can I best put it? Because you need to be careful because you're only checking a certain, essentially, fraction of those simulations. And you need to be careful. So if you sort of look over integrating over all the possible outputs, you can show that this gives you that the weight that you end up with would essentially is consistent with it being from the ABC posterior of the high fidelity model. So you need to make that reweighting to make sure that that is the case, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense quite.
Okay, so so the way you figured it out was by doing the math and not kind of intuition guided.
So there's certainly, so if you look at this, there's, I guess, a range of different values that this weight can actually end up taking, right? So, and that can be, it's all the combinations of whether or not you would accept under the low fidelity model and whether or not you would accept under the high fidelity model if you sort of check. And I guess one of the reasons you need to reweight is that occasionally under the low fidelity model you're kind of going to make the wrong decision, and you're not going to check that you've made it. And I think when you do this reweighting, that undoes effectively the mistakes that you make. If that's kind of an intuitive, if that works.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. I think there was another question, or temporarily there was a hand up. Okay, well, David has a question in the chat. Can you access it, Ruth, or I can read it out?
Yeah, 1 second. Where are we? Oh, David, yeah. Would it be useful to choose as the low fidelity model the same auxiliary model that are sometimes used to generate summary statistics in ABC? Go on, David. Do you want to explain a bit more? Because I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, can you hear me, Ruth?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah.
So I know Chris Giovanni has some work on using auxiliary models for generating summary statistics, and
Yeah.
Gail and I have also some work on this. What we found is that these auxiliary models are kind of cheap versions of the structural model, the kind of generative model, but we use them to generate useful summary statistics and then do ABC on those summary statistics. But you could think of using those auxiliary models not just for generating the summary statistics, but also as the low fidelity model that you generate from.
Okay. I don't see. I guess that the thing that the assumption that I guess that we are making at the moment is that you have the same parameters in all the models, so you've got to be careful of that.
The same parameters or the same parameter interpretation?
At the moment, I guess parameters, but I don't see it possibly could be extended.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess at the moment you're really relying on the fact that you are directly testing exactly the same parameters in one model as you are in the other, and that's definitely a constraint at the moment. But I think there are questions about whether you could take this approach on a subset of the parameters, for example.
Yeah, that's more what I was thinking. Like there are lots of models that have similar parameters in common, but maybe not all the parameters.
So I don't necessarily see why it wouldn't work, but maybe Tom can always jump in and add something as well.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to shut off my mic now.
Hello, hi, it's Tom. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So I just wanted to say basically, as long as you could, if you think about how the multi-fidelity algorithm worked, you generated a parameter vector, and then you have to be able to generate the low fidelity model from that parameter vector. So as long as there was a map from the parameter vector to the low fidelity specific parameters, then yeah, that would work. It's if there's no function, or if you could end up having multiple parameters, that might be a bit less possible. But I don't see why not, because I guess your you could think about the parameter space of the low fidelity model as almost being like kind of new random numbers or something like that, that you then discard when you simulate the high fidelity model. So you could conceivably do this without necessarily having completely nested parameter spaces.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking of it as like a restricted version, for instance, of the high fidelity model would work.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Good point.
Thank you.
Jochen, go ahead, please.
Hi, Ruth, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I can.
Yeah, so my question was just about so you get these posterior distributions, and I was wondering whether it's possible to show that these posterior distributions then are the same as you would with the normal high fidelity model by itself. Like, is that something one can prove, or is it more that the algorithm is just designed to approximate that distribution somehow?
So you can essentially show that the weights, if you integrate over the prior distribution, the weights that come out would be consistent with what you would get from just using a high fidelity model, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right,
Can I just follow up on that scale again?
Oh, yeah.
So when you showed your plots of your draws,
Yeah.
even though you showed you had a lot more efficiency with your use of the low fidelity model, when you did the weighting of the two, I mean, you did have a lot more variation, didn't you, in the draws?
Yeah.
Yeah, which makes sense. You would expect that, I suppose. And that kind of relates to if you were to choose more low fidelity models, that might exacerbate that problem.
I think you're really right. It's something you've got to consider in that context, and you've got to weigh that trade up, weigh out that trade off quite carefully. Yeah. All right. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll keep going, and I'll try to be fairly brief about the second bit. Where are we? Okay. So then the question that we had is very much, can you combine this idea of multi-fidelity with other ways to increase the efficiency of ABC? And I guess I already alluded to that in the context of being able to do SMC, do this in an SMC context using sequential importance sampling. So really, what am I talking about? I'm talking about using a sequence of essentially thresholds, epsilon1 to epsilon t, and essentially sort of moving my at each of my generations, essentially taking the output of the previous generation, so the posterior from the previous generation, using it to construct an importance distribution to sample at the next generation. Again, I think it's probably something that's familiar to most people listening. So I guess the question you need to ask though is, what is it about multi-fidelity ABC that makes this slightly harder than it normally would be? There's two things you've got to work out how to do. You've got to work out how to use importance sampling in the context of multi-fidelity ABC, and then you've got to work out how to do that kind of repeatedly using a sequence of importance distributions. So the first thing, in integrating importance sampling into the multi-fidelity ABC framework is relatively simple. You just do it in exactly the same way you normally would. You would generate theta. So here, oh shoot, you can't see that. You generate theta in line 3 by sampling from your importance distribution. You do everything else exactly the same way as you would in sort of regular multi-fidelity ABC, and then you just reweight at the end of the algorithm. So that's all good, and we can work out how to do that. But the real stumbling block was then how do you kind of put this in and do it repeatedly, like in ABC SMC? And the problem arises really because you're going to use the accepted particles and the weights that you get from one generation to form the importance distribution in the next generation. And what I really glossed over, and maybe I alluded to slightly in the questions, was actually that some of the weights that can come out of multi-fidelity ABC can actually be negative. So this happens because at times you'll accept parameters into your posterior distribution using the low fidelity model, and you won't check whether you should do that or not. So there are regions of parameter space in which you'll kind of just slightly over accept parameter values, and then all of a sudden you'll generate your sample from your posterior, and you'll check that decision and you'll realize you've got it wrong, and then you end up with one of these negative weights, and that sort of reduces the mass that's in the area of that area of the posterior distribution. So you have a problem essentially because some of the weights that can come out of multi-fidelity can be negative. So the idea that Tom came up with was essentially to define a new non-negative importance distribution and then to use defensive importance sampling to sample from that. What's the idea? Hopefully it's illustrated in this figure. So with the blue dashed lines, you could see that they would be essentially represent 4 accepted parameters into the posterior distribution of the previous generation. And 3 of those are going to have positive weights, and 1 of them would have had a negative weight coming out of the multi-fidelity approach. So then when you sort of perturb your parameters using this perturbation kernel K and you weight them, this is kind of what you would get for 1 of those parameters to 3 of those parameters, and this is the 4th one down here that would have been negative. So if you add those all together to get your importance distribution, it would give you what you get for the green dashed line, and you can just see here that somewhere between sort of 1 and 2, this importance distribution actually becomes negative. So we can't. It's not a valid importance distribution. We can't use it. So the solution that Tom came up with was essentially to add on a small amount of the prior distribution. Okay, so you take the maximum of 0 and the importance distribution that you had before. You take some proportion of that and some proportion of the prior distribution, and if you add those 2 together, essentially you'll come up with something that is positive on the whole support of the prior distribution. So this is just an example, a toy problem where the prior runs between -2 and 2 on theta, and you can see that if we add a small amount of the prior distribution, which I think was just uniform on -2, 2, to the importance distribution that came out of the previous generation, that you could make something that was non-negative everywhere on the support of the prior. So essentially, if you do that, that provides you a way in which to sample to generate a valid importance distribution and also to sample from that. Then you can go away and kind of build in all the other machinery. So you can estimate the continuation probabilities at each generation on the fly using information from the previous generations that you've got. So the details are all in the paper and it's on archive, so I don't want to go through it. But I'm just going to show some examples from a Kuromoto oscillator network. So essentially this is a set of oscillators I running from 1 through capital M, where you've got an angular velocity. Each oscillator has its own angular velocity omega I, which is drawn from a Cauchy distribution with the parameters omega 0 and gamma. And then it's coupled, every oscillator is coupled to every other oscillator in the network in the normal way. Okay, and then you've got a coupling strength, capital K. So you base the low fidelity model on tracking essentially all the parameters of the system, and you can make a certain ansatz and do some reduction in order to get essentially a description of sort of the magnitude and a low dimensional description in terms of the magnitude and the phase of the distribution of oscillators. So the details are probably not sort of super important, but just to say that this is our sort of high fidelity model, and down at the bottom here is our low fidelity model, and importantly again they've got all the same parameters in them. Okay, so and here's just sort of some typical simulation output. So you can see that you estimate the phase pretty well, and that the noise in this comes in from the fact that individual oscillators have got their own angular velocity. Okay, so let's apply multi-fidelity ABC SMC to the system to identify all 3 of the parameters, so the coupling strength and the mean and the variability of the angular velocity distribution. So what we did was do SMC over 8 generations with a set of set acceptance schedule, and then we're calculating efficiency by looking at the effective sample size within the last generation, so the 8th generation of SMC, as a function of, relative to total simulation time. So you can see that when you just use ABC SMC, then your efficiency in terms of effective number of samples per second is relatively low, but if you use multi-fidelity ABC SMC, then the efficiency is much higher. And you can see that, again, you're generating sort of similar posterior distributions, but the simulation time is much improved when you use ABC, multi-fidelity ABC SMC rather than vanilla SMC with the same parameters. Okay, and then just one of the final things I wanted to show was essentially kind of what's happening within each individual generation and how efficient are things within each individual generation. So this is 3 generations 1 through 8 depicted on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, again, we're just looking at efficiency in terms of effective sample size per second. So the first distribution, it's all the same because you're sampling from the prior distribution. And then immediately you can see that the efficiency of multi-fidelity ABC SMC jumps up relative to that of vanilla ABC SMC. And that efficiency is maintained over the kind of middle generations, if you like, that sort of tails off towards the final generation where you're getting quite close. So your efficiency really gains are all made in the intermediate distributions where epsilon is still relatively large. Okay, and then this is kind of just echoed by this plot here, which just shows you what these continuation probabilities look like over successive generations. So eta 1, which is the probability that you require a high fidelity model simulation given the low fidelity model is close, is on this axis, and then given that it's far is eta 2, and that's on the vertical axis. So you can see that kind of a very early generation, so down here is epsilon 2, essentially your probability of using the high fidelity model no matter what is very small. So given the low fidelity model is close, or if it's far, it is very, very small. You're checking sort of a very small fraction of the time. And as you go up into the kind of middle generation, so epsilon 4 and epsilon 6, you can certainly see that you sort of begin to check sort of slightly more often if that high fidelity model is close, but if the high fidelity model is far, you're still not sort of checking. And once you get up to the to the later generations where epsilon now is really quite small, then you're beginning to check increasingly often the output. And in particular, you're not checking so much if the low fidelity model is far away because you're kind of feeling that it's safe to throw away those parameter values. But you're checking quite frequently if the low fidelity model is close. And at some point, many of these simulations actually just ended up in sort of only being an early rejection almost system. Okay, what else did I have to say? Oh, I think that's it pretty much. Just wanted to say in the second half that it's possible to incorporate both multi-fidelity and SMC approaches in generating posterior. And I didn't really touch on this, but you can choose a sequence of acceptance thresholds adaptively in the same way you can for regular ABC SMC. And one way in which we thought about doing that was to maintain efficiency across generations. But I think there are many, many open questions. I think Gail already brought up one, which is, can you and how do you use multiple low fidelity models? And you certainly can, but what's the best way to do that, I think, is still very much an open question. How can you best design and estimate the continuation probabilities? So we took a quite simple approach to that, which just depended on the outputs in a kind of binary way on the outputs of the low fidelity model, but it could also depend on parameter space and it could be much more fine-grained. And also how to choose the optimal perturbation kernels, because the demands of multi-fidelity at ABC are maybe a little bit, multi-fidelity at ABC SMC are maybe a bit different from regular ABC SMC. Okay, I probably should stop there because I feel like we're out of time. But I just wanted to acknowledge Tom in particular again, who did all of the multi-fidelity work, and everyone else who contributed to various bits of this talk in one way or another. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, thanks a lot, Ruth. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So I think Linus had was the first. He asked, how do you determine delta, the proportion of how much of the prior to mix into the importance distribution? Is this a hyperparameter that needs to be optimized?
Hi, Linus. Yeah, good question. So I guess essentially you kind of want to. We haven't looked into too much detail, but I think the short answer is that you want to add in as little of the prior as possible into that importance distribution in some ways, because what you're doing with ABC SMC is trying to essentially move away from this is quite the right way to say it, but you're kind of trying to focus your energies on regions of the prior distribution in which you think the posterior mass lie, if you like. So if you kind of add back in that posterior distribution, you're kind of undoing slightly the good you've done with SMC. So you don't want to do it too much. Short answer.
So I think Dennis's question is then related to that, namely, I guess to use the importance proposal instead of the prior and the correction, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I think Tom's already answered partly. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Dennis. I think you probably could, as Tom says. Essentially, what you just need to be able to do is keep that importance distribution positive, and you need to be able to sample from it. But I don't think there's any reason in which you couldn't use, any reason for which you couldn't necessarily use a previous importance distribution, because presumably that is moving, that is more in the right direction of where you want to be than the prior is.
And yeah, I think Linus then further asks, yeah, what goes wrong if we just choose delta equals to 0?
Offhand,
so I guess you just wouldn't want any completely zero weight in your parameter space, right? Is that it?
Yeah, you still need to be able to sample from those regions, I think, even if with very small probability. Yeah. Otherwise, there is a danger that you're kind of going to exclude regions of parameter space that would produce some feasible simulations.
I think just for valid importance sampling, you need your importance distribution to be able to explore the entire support.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? If not, I think we conclude the talk because we had already quite many questions in between, and we well, thank you for the very interesting talk with some virtual claps. And this was the last talk before the summer break, and we will then be back in September the 3rd for the next talks. Thanks all for the participation.
Thanks, everyone.